Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to do another tier list. And so we have already done a tier list for every single limited character in the game. It's fair to say that that one was a little bit controversial, basically due to the placement that I had of certain characters like Jiyan and Jinhsi. Frankly, I don't really care. At the end of the day, right, it is my opinion on the matter. And what I wanted to do today was move forward with my opinion on another tier list. And this one is going to be, ladies and gentlemen, not on the limited characters, but their weapons. It's important to keep in mind that Wuthering Waves has a lot of systems, right, that make it a lot easier to pull a limited weapon. Let me just go ahead and pull some information up. So for this weapon over here, Age of Harvest Jinhsi signature, it's guaranteed within 80 pulls. And this is also the thing, ladies and gentlemen. When you pull and you get these blue corals, every single version, you'll gain 7 limited weapon pulls in exchange for these blue corals. Every single time a version update happens. And so you naturally will have a lot more resources to actually pull on weapon banners. And, you know, eventually, right, if you save for long enough over enough versions, you'll get one for free. But there's a lot of incentive, right, to actually use your astrite. As you can tell, I'm a little bit low at the moment. I don't even know how it's possible to have an astrite level of 1, but that's where I'm at right now. You have a lot of incentive to actually go ahead and pull on those limited weapon banners. It could be due to the 4 stars that you see on here, or it could be obviously due to the weapon itself. And ladies and gentlemen, these weapons, they're worth it. And today, we're going to be talking about the weapons in particular that are the most worth it in comparison to others. So with that, we're just going to be going in release order of the weapons themselves, starting with Jiyan and then going all the way over to Roccia's. And we're going to be ranking them, right, on a tier list from SS all the way to C. There's no weapon in the game that's honestly bad enough to warrant a rank of D or lower. So with that, let's go ahead and get right on into it. So first weapon up that we're going to have is Jiyan's Verdant Summit. And let me just say that this weapon, when we consider its use cases, when we consider who on the roster can actually use it, I would say it's pretty close to either an A or potentially B tier. The reason why I'm going to call it A to B tier is the fact that its weapon skill is pretty fucking unique. It grants a 48% buff to heavy attack damage when you do things like an intro skill or cast your Resonance Liberation. And let me be honest, ladies and gentlemen, across Broadblade users, right, characters like Jinhsi, characters like Calcharo, characters like Lumi, Jiyan's kind of the only one that really does heavy attack damage. It also comes equipped with a 48% crit damage main stat and a 12% attribute damage buff. Those are pretty much best in slot. Attribute damage makes it usable on pretty much every single Broadblade user in the game, and the fact that it's crit damage does make it a little bit harder to build around because you'll be pairing it with, well, let's be honest here, you'll typically pair it with something, right, that's a crit rate forecast. And what that means is that 22% crit rate that you're seeing on the Echo, it isn't as high as the crit rate that you might be seeing on something like Age of Harvest, right? Which is going to have 24.3. It's a crit rate weapon, and it's also Jinhsi's signature. So keeping that in mind, it's a little bit harder to build around. It has some obvious weaknesses compared to other weapons in that it does, again, that heavy attack damage buff. And so it's really specific and only usable on him for that part of the weapon effect. But based off its attribute damage bonus alone or based off its attribute damage bonus and its crit damage buff, it's typically going to be better than the standard 5-star in pretty much every single way possible. So with that, that's the reason why it's not in C, or that's the reason why it's competitive in A. It's simply due to the fact that, you know, it's still widely applicably used, but it's not really that useful on the weapon effect side. However, it's amazing on Jiyan, as you would expect, being his signature. Next up, we've got the next weapon, Stringmaster. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, you all know where this one's gonna go. This is the best limited weapon in the game. And let me tell you why. This weapon, ladies and gentlemen, gives a massive 36% crit rate. It gives 36% critical rate. That makes it so that on any character you equip it on, it will give you a 41% base critical rate. And that means with just 3 or 4 substats, right, of maybe 7 to 8% critical rate, you're already at 70+%. And when you combine it with something like a character's skill tree, right, these buffs to critical rate, my oh my, you get to a point where you can just miss a critical rate substat and still have a critical rate over like 75 or 80% just because this weapon is amazing from its base stats. It also happens to give a 12% attribute damage bonus, which again makes it widely usable on any character. And this is the other thing. It gives a pretty general buff where as long as you deal resonant skill damage, you'll increase your attack by 12% up to 2 times. Zhezhi is the worst user of this weapon effect because she can only stack it up 1 time and it doesn't last for a very long time. However, obviously characters like Yinlin and Encore can proc this effect rapidly and for a very, very long time. And that makes it super good on them, right? Encore activates it really well, and so does obviously Yinlin being her signature. So keep that in mind, right? It's super easy to build around. I actually recommend String Master over Zhezhi's own signature based off of how easy it makes her to build, because you'll also be able to share things in the build like the 4-cost echo as well. Things like if you're using the coordinated attack set, right? You'll be able to share it across multiple characters, for example, a crit damage one, and that just means, right, you're spending less time echo farming. You're able to be a lot more efficient with your resources, and it helps out a lot in your building. So with Phoebe being a rectifier user as well, she's probably going to get some level of mileage out of String Master as long as she isn't a healer. Because guess what? The only characters that cannot use String Master very well are Baija, Shorekeeper, and Verena, because they're healers. And so as long as Phoebe isn't a healer, even if she scales off defense or HP, she'll still be able to use this. So I recommend this to basically every single player for future proofing. I think that its weapon effect is way too general compared to the other weapons. The fact that it gives an attack buff, and it simply makes it one of the easiest weapons to ever build around. And it's going to be a great asset to your account to save you on the echo grind too, for your entire roster. Next up, we're going to have Jinhsi's signature, Age of Harvest. And let me just be honest when I say that Age of Harvest is a lot better than Jiyan's weapon. Because guess what, ladies and gentlemen? This thing should probably go into S tier. The reason why I say S tier is kind of like the opposite reason for why we talked about Jiyan's weapon. Age of Harvest gives a resonance skill damage buff, and most characters in the Broadblade category deal resonance skill damage. This weapon is actually surprisingly good on Jiyan based off of that because, well, Jiyan uses his resonance skill and gains buffs to his resonance skill damage across his liberation. Kalcharo uses them semi-frequently to apply buffs and do cancels across the rest of his kit, and Lumi makes it work as well. It also provides the same exact general attribute damage buff of 12% that we're seeing on Jiyan's, and as you saw earlier, has that critical rate main stat of 24.3%, making it even easier to build around on the echo side. Because at the end of the day, right, compared to a crit damage weapon, which would use the 4-cost echo and crit, it gives about 2.3% more. And that might not seem like a lot, but that's the difference between a 6.3% echo roll and an 8.5%. And believe me when I say you start noticing that over time. So it's only 2.3%, but when it comes to critical rate, you're pretty happy to have a number like that. And because its weapon skill, boosting resonance skill damage, is applicable to so many different members of the roster, it's a great thing to use, just to provide like a little bit of a damage buff on everybody at the bare minimum. And so because of that, it's usable on every single member of the Broadblade roster. It has better stats than Jiyan's, and you could make the argument that it's an A, but because of this, and because of its general use cases, I'm gonna have to put it into S. And the great news is, ladies and gentlemen, it is available right now. And another great thing about the fact that it's available right now, I'll show you all what makes it so amazing right now. It comes equipped with variation on the weapon banner. Pretty much the best 4-star weapon in the game. And so if you don't have it, pulling this weapon right now might be one of the best things that you can do for your account because you might get variation in the process. And believe me, getting this along with variation, it's one of the best things that you can do to strengthen your overall account. So we've gotten into this whole situation, right? We've gone over Age of Harvest. Now it's time to talk about another weapon released in version 1.1, and that's going to be Blazing Brilliance. And ladies and gentlemen, let me make a bit of a confession. One of my biggest regrets across Wuthering Waves is not pulling this weapon. Not because it's amazing on Changli, but because of the fact that, well, this weapon might be Rover's best weapon in the game. And it's actually usable on so many more characters than you might think. I'm actually considering putting it in SSS, but I think it belongs at the very top of S. The reason why it belongs at the very top of S is for one simple reason. It's a critical damage weapon. And there are some characters on the roster, like Spectral Rover, like Havoc Rover, that want a critical damage weapon and a critical damage forecast. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on whether or not you own it, or this is the only critical damage sword in the game, game across 5 stars. There's nothing else. And what this means is that for some characters, let me just pull up the ones I'm talking about. For characters like Spectral Rover, who will gain the benefits of things like the Spectro Frazzle set, 20% critical rate over here, and 15% critical rate over here in their skill tree. You know what that means? That means with a weapon like Emerald of Genesis, you're going to overcap. You're going to overcap on critical rate and have too much, and it won't be that good. And if you do decide to switch over to Havoc Rover, you're also going to want to keep in mind that at S6, which you're going to get someday, their baseline critical rate increases by 25% when they activate their Forte circuit. And you know what that means? You're probably going to want a critical damage weapon to make use of this, because that is more than what's on a 4-cost Echo. This is more critical rate than what's on a 4-cost Echo. We'll probably get it in another patch or two. And so what that means is that Xiangli's signature has so many more use cases than you might actually think, just based off of the fact that it's a critical damage weapon. However, there are some downsides to it, and there's a reason why it's not SSS. And the reason why it's not SSS is based off of the fact that, well, it only has an attack buff, not a general attribute damage buff like the other weapons. Typically, an attribute damage buff is going to be better than just an attack one for most characters. And it also has a slightly interesting resonant skill damage buff that a lot of people are able to get a use out of, specifically characters like Spectral Rover and Havoc Rover. But there are also characters, right, like Yang or maybe Sanhua, who aren't getting as much of a benefit from it. Sanhua actually gets a decent amount because she doesn't really need ER that much. And this is the other thing, and perhaps the most important thing about this, is that this has a perfectly viable option to be used instead, and that's Emerald of Genesis. Because, ladies and gentlemen, Emerald of Genesis has really great stats. It has built-in crit rate, it has ER, and it also has a 12% attack buff that stacks based off the number attacks you do. And this thing is fine. This thing is great. It's one of the best standard weapons on the roster, and it just gets the job done for most characters anyways. And you'll also, based off your standard pulls, you'll be able to rank this up even more and more, get those sensitizations, and then slowly increase the buff over time. And it gives a lot of ER with each dupe. A lot with each dupe. So because of the fact that there are all of these options available, it kind of, for me, falls a little bit. It makes Blazing Brilliance fall short from SSS because you can use other things. And nothing's really going to be too much of a loss, especially considering that it's a standard alternative. All right, our next weapon is Zhezhi's. And I'm going to be honest, this thing sucks. And the only reason why this thing sucks is because String Master is in the game. People are saying B. Guys, it's C. It's C. This thing has a lot of weaknesses, and the main one is the fact that String Master is so fucking good. The reason why this is in C, think about it this way. If String Master wasn't in the game, this would be B. If String Master wasn't in the game, this one would be in B. But the fact that these two cost the same number of pulls makes Zhezhi's signature one of the worst things in the game. Because A, this thing doesn't give a general attribute damage buff. It gives 12% attack. So that's the first ding against it. And this is the next ding. This weapon gives critical damage instead of critical rate. It gives 72% critical damage instead of 36% critical rate. And what that oftentimes means is that this thing can be an absolute pain to build around compared to String Master. And if you own both weapons, you'll find that String Master is simply more convenient to use. But we've only talked about the general stats. We've now got to talk about the weapon effect. And this weapon effect might be one of the most specific things in the game. It gives a stacking buff to basic attack damage when you use resonance skills, and then activates a special buff when you use an outro skill that amplifies your off-field basic attack damage. And what this means is that Encore is the only other character that can use its on-field effect, and it doesn't really do that much for her. And the next problem is Zhezhi is the only character that can use its off-field effect. And when compared to String Master, in overall calculations, String Master is still typically only a couple of percentage points behind it. It's only a couple of percentage points behind it in overall calculations. And String Master's much easier to build around. And for every other character in the game that's DPS, String Master gives better buffs. Encore does basic attack damage, so you might think this weapon is okay on her, but String Master is better for her overall DPS than this thing. And so this is Zhezhi is the only character where this is best in slot on, and String Master just wins out for every single other character. And so because of that, ladies and gentlemen, if you're pulling this weapon without having this weapon, at least at this point in the game, in the middle of 2.0, it is one of the worst value pull decisions you can make in the game, objectively. As long as this is in the game, and as long as this thing has so few users, it's just not really that great of a pull. It's just honestly not that great of a pull. If you're offended by that, I'm sorry, but it's really not that good. All right. Next up, we're gonna have Xiangli Yao's weapon. This thing buffs Resonance Liberation damage, gives a general attribute damage buff, and has the same stat profile as Jinhsi's weapon. This thing's an easy A. The reason why it's an A is because by buffing Resonance Liberation, it actually is usable on every gauntlet user, and it's going to have an effect. However, the thing is, a lot of users of this weapon, potentially, other than Xiangli Yao, they don't do a lot of Resonance Liberation damage. And so this buffs something. However, it also gives a nice critical rate boost, which the Gauntlet class didn't really have until Roccia's weapon released, because the standard Gauntlet only buffs attack. And based off its general attribute damage buff, and the fact that every Gauntlet user does do some liberation damage, it's usable on everybody. And it's generally an upgrade over the standard 5-star. And the thing is, it's higher ranked than Jiyan's for a simple reason. It actually buffs other characters' damage. Other characters don't really use heavy attacks. And so people are only using Jiyan's weapon purely for its stat profile and its general attribute damage buff. That same thing applies to Xiangli Yao's weapon, but you can also use it for, well, a slight damage boost. And obviously, right, on Xiangli Yao himself, this weapon is absolutely insane. This weapon is absolutely nuts. It makes him deal a ton of fucking damage. All right, so that's going to be Xiangli Yao's weapon. Now it's time to move on to potentially the next controversial weapon here. And this one's going to be Shorekeeper's. If we're thinking about this from a value perspective, ladies and gentlemen, Shorekeeper's signature might be one of the worst things in the game. It might be one of the worst things in the game. A lot of people might think that Shorekeeper's weapon is fantastic because it gives a 14% attack buff. Ladies and gentlemen, if a 14% attack buff is the difference between you clearing and not clearing, you can just level up your skills or farm better echoes. It quite literally, compared to variation, it gives more ER, it gives HP, and generates less concerto energy than most variations. Guys, 14% attack is close to maybe 4 to 5% more damage on your DPS. And spending 80 pulls to deal that little extra damage is really not worth it. It's really not worth it at all. It might look nice, but the only thing that any person is getting value from when it comes to this weapon, the only people that get value out of this weapon are speedrunners, so that they can say their max is S0R1, and they can squeeze out as much damage as possible from an S0R1 team. What about the ER? The ER on this weapon allows you to have more freedom in your echo substats while you're playing Shorekeeper. That literally means you're spending limited pulls on a weapon so that you can roll a couple less ER subs on your support. This is you saying, I'm gonna go ahead and spend 80 pulls so I can spend less time grinding echoes on one character. But that's the thing. It's really not that hard to reach 230 ER on Shorekeeper. It's actually very easy to reach 230 ER on Shorekeeper. You want to know how easy it is to reach 230 ER? I can have a maxed out variation, level 90 variation, and a Spectro damage bonus 3 cost. A Spectro damage bonus 3 cost, and still have 230 ER with variation. And you know what that means, ladies and gentlemen? That means if I had Shorekeeper's signature, all that would mean is that I don't have to roll an ER sub on like a couple of my pieces. It is one of the biggest cope decisions you can make in the game, is spending so many limited pulls just because you don't want to grind a couple of echoes. And this is the other thing, guys. You might be saying, oh, it'll let your discernment do so much more damage because she'll have HP. Guys, the difference between a discernment doing 5k damage per tick and a discernment doing 20k damage per tick, you want to know what that damage difference is? That is 15k versus 60k. That's 45k damage in a team rotation. Assuming the Shorekeeper is giga built, that's nothing. 45k damage in a rotation is nothing. It's almost non-existent. That's like a character sneezing. That's like your main DPS sneezing during the rotation. And that is going to be the damage bonus that you have, assuming like the worst case scenario, by going from variation to a giga built Stellar Symphony Shorekeeper. And most of the time, it's not really going to be a significant upgrade at all. And so most people saying untrue, they're coping. So yes, that is why it's going in C tier. Because when you can swap weapons in the tower, it's not worth it. So yeah, an R5 variation gives you a lot faster rotation time compared to an S1 or an R1 Stellar Symphony. And in some team comps and in some rotations, an R5 variation will actually lead to higher team DPS than a R1 Stellar Symphony. This thing can be literally outperformed by a 4-star weapon. That's not something I can say for any limited 5-star. I don't know any other limited 5-star that gets outperformed by an R5 4-star. And Stellar Symphony is one of them. Alright, next up, ladies and gentlemen, we've got another weapon. And this one is going to be Camellya's. And some people might not be very happy with where I put this weapon. I think it's B tier. Because this weapon, it might be end of B tier. Actually, I'm going to be honest, it might be C tier. Because guess what, guys? The only character in the game that can use this and not have it be a DPS loss compared to Emerald of Genesis is Camellya. This weapon actually sucks on every other character because Emerald of Genesis is in the game. On every other character other than Camellya, Emerald of Genesis is typically better. It's S tier on Camellya, but on every other character, you either would rather use Blazing Brilliance, you would either use this or Emerald of Genesis. And this is the thing, guys. It has the same exact stats as Emerald of Genesis. Emerald of Genesis gives ER, and Emerald of Genesis also gives around 12% attack. This just gives 12% attack and a basic attack buff, and a further upgraded basic attack buff that only Camellya can access because you have to consume Concerto energy. And this is the thing, guys. Because Havoc Rover can use it, just because Havoc Rover can use it, I'll put it at the end of B tier. But this is the thing, guys. You have to think about it this way. If you're using Havoc Rover, or if you have Camellya's weapon, you probably have Camellya, and so you're probably never going to actually use Havoc Rover if you have Camellya. That's kind of just how it is. You're almost never going to actually use Havoc Rover if you have Camellya in the first place. And if you have Camellya's weapon, you probably have her. And so it ends up in a situation, right, where you really only use it on her, and that's fine, but you're really never going to use it on anybody else, ever. And so we'll give it end of B, but you can easily make the argument that it's C, because there is really no other character sword user in the game that uses basic attacks except for Havoc Rover. And that's only if they're being played as a hyper carry and not quick swap. Because if Rover's being played quick swap, you're not using their basic attacks, and Emerald of Genesis is better. So it's usable on Rover in one of their team comps. Do keep that in mind. It makes Camellya amazing, but Camellya already clears like crazy with Emerald of Genesis. Let's just drop it into C for now. All right, our next weapon is going to be the Last Dance. And this is an interesting one. I'm going to put it at bottom of S. The reason why I'm going to put this at the bottom of S is because it is the only actual DPS pistol in the game. Because guess what, guys? Static Mist is there. It has a critical rate substat, but Static Mist is mainly a sub-DPS weapon. It grants a buff on outro skill to the incoming Resonator that buffs their attack, and doesn't actually have a weapon effect that impacts the actual wielder. And so what that means is that the Last Dance is quite literally the only 5-star weapon with 5-star base stats that will really boost the user's DPS. It's usable on Alto, it's usable on Chisha, it's obviously biz on Carlotta, and it is usable on Mortifi. And it also comes with a very unique stat profile that is 500 attack and 72% critical damage. And this lets its users do a lot of damage. And this is the thing, right? Because it's also resonant skill damage based as well, that means that in most scenarios, it is going to boost at least a part of a character's damage profile with its effect. It's not something like heavy attacks, right? Where the characters never use them. It's not something like basic attacks, right? Where a character might not ever use them. Isn't the duration too low? Well, you can just throw a resonant skill out, right? After your liberation, after an intro skill, and it typically works fine. It's something that could easily go down in rankings over time, but at least for the current state of the game, there aren't really a lot of pistol wielders either, but it can be used on all of them to relatively high effect. And it's a different situation than like Emerald of Genesis and Swords, where Static Mist is mainly used for buffing. So, we've just ranked Carlotta's. We've got one other weapon on the list. And ladies and gentlemen, you probably know where this one's going to go. This one is tragic. It's a little bit of a comedy. And I'm going to be honest, it sucks. Tragic comedy. Rossia's signature. And the big problem with it is that it's basically just a worse version of Xiangli Yao's for every single character, aside from Roccia herself. Because, ladies and gentlemen, nobody really uses heavy attacks on the roster, and the only other gauntlet user that does, Jiyan, the duration on it isn't even long enough for her to activate it fully on her Forte circuit. And so what that means is that it's barely functional on her, doesn't really work that well, and it only works for Roccia. It does have critical rate, but it's the same exact stat profile, again, as Xiangli Yao's. And then Xiangli Yao's just has an effect that works on more characters. And this just means that, well, this thing kind of sucks. This thing kind of sucks. However, Xiangli Yao's isn't such a crazy good option like String Master that just makes this such a low value pull. If Xiangli Yao's weapon was more universal and better on more characters, then it might earn the lowest spot. But just because String Master exists, Zhezhi's signature is at the lowest. Because you should always be pulling this instead of this in pretty much every single situation. And this isn't as good as this. And so that's why this is ranked a little bit higher. And I would just say, you really should only be pulling this weapon if you like Roccia a lot and you really want to have her do as much damage in the overworld as possible, or if you're playing Roccia as a main DPS. And if you're not, just put Xiangli Yao's weapon on her. You're going to lose a 48% heavy attack buff. She doesn't really do that much damage in the first place. So it's not like you're losing a lot. And if you don't have Xiangli Yao's weapon, you could think about pulling it for the critical rate, but then you're going to go ahead, use it on other characters, and it's just going to be a stat stick. And the last thing about the stat profile is that it gives attack percentage, Xiangli Yao's general attribute damage buff. And so Xiangli Yao's general attribute damage buff is even better, because it'll buff characters like Yan Wu if you do decide to use Verity's handle on Yan Wu. This is going to give attack and just suck on Yan Wu from that perspective. Because literally, it's just less overall damage in comparison. And obviously, this is only going to go up until 2.0. We don't know what Phoebe's and Brad's weapons are going to be looking like, so we're not going to be ranking them. But for now, this is, in my opinion, what the tier list is looking like for limited weapons in terms of value. And we factored in things like who can actually use all these different weapons, all the different wielders in the class, whether or not it has synergy with them. And based off of the current use cases that are in the game as of 2.0, I think this is kind of where everything stands. This might be, in my opinion, kind of like the main must-pull weapon in the game. And all is not lost with Changli as a pull, because her weapon is extremely high value just because of how many characters you can use it on, and its very, very unique stat profile. When it comes to most DPS characters' 5-star weapons, it's typically worth pulling at least one critical 5-star for every single weapon class. Because obviously, I've mentioned it a couple of times, you can share weapons across the Tower of Adversity. And what that means, right, is that by having at least one critical weapon for each class, you can make their echo building, their endgame builds, a lot easier to manage. And actually reach like those higher damage tiers for clearing things like holograms, for clearing things like the TOA. And, you know, just switch your forecast echo accordingly, right? If you have a critical damage one, use a critical rate, use critical damage. And having one of each class makes it a really, really easier grind for your account. And these are, in my opinions, the best value ones that you can pull for all of those different classes. And you're going to notice, right, one weapon for each class is what you're going to see from SSS all the way to A. So yeah, let me know what you all think, and peace out.